The city never truly slept. It merely shifted, changing faces as the night swallowed the daylight. In the darkness, the streets whispered with secrets, some too dangerous to be spoken aloud. Behind the towering buildings and flickering streetlights, a corrupt system thrived, protected by those who wore the badge not as a symbol of justice, but as a shield against accountability. For years, the people who were supposed to serve and protect had done the opposite. Officers who had sworn to uphold the law had instead bent it to their will, turning it into a weapon to silence anyone who stood against them. Complaints were buried, evidence disappeared, and the very people meant to root out corruption became its enforcers. But one woman refused to let it continue. Elena Ramirez was no stranger to the shadows. As a high-ranking federal investigator, she had spent years digging into cases that others feared to touch. She knew how corruption spread, like a virus, infecting everything it touched. And now, she was on the brink of uncovering something that could shake the city's entire law enforcement system to its core. For months, she had been gathering evidence against a network of officers protecting criminals, covering up crimes, and eliminating those who stood in their way. It wasn't just a few bad apples. It was a well-oiled machine, operated by those who had spent years ensuring they were untouchable. Tonight, she was about to get the final piece of the puzzle. One of the most dangerous names in her files was Officer Mark Sullivan. He was a man with a long history of brutality, a cop who saw himself as above the law. Complaints against him never stuck because he had powerful people watching his back, people who needed men like him to keep their dirty work hidden. Sullivan wasn't just corrupt, he was a predator in uniform. He thrived on control, intimidation, and the certainty that he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. Then there was Officer Jake Harris, his partner. Unlike Sullivan, Harris wasn't a true villain, at least not yet. He was a man trapped between his conscience and his fear. He knew what Sullivan did was wrong, but he also knew what happened to officers who spoke up, and that fear kept him silent. Elena drove through the nearly deserted streets, her hands firm on the steering wheel. The city lights blurred in her peripheral vision, but her mind was razor-focused on what lay ahead. She was heading to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a meeting point chosen not by her, but by the anonymous informant who had reached out with a simple but urgent message. "I have undeniable proof, but I can only meet you alone. If they find out I talked, I'm dead." She had heard these words before, many times. Some informants made it to their meetings, others never showed up at all. But something about this one felt different. She could sense it, the weight in his voice, the urgency, the way he had hesitated before giving her the location. This wasn't just another low-level officer with second thoughts. This was someone deep inside the system, someone who had seen things they weren't supposed to see, and someone who knew that the moment they spoke, they would become a target. Elena had been trained to trust her instincts. Right now, those instincts were screaming at her. As she navigated through the quiet streets, she noticed it. The subtle shift in the air, the nagging sensation that she wasn't alone. She glanced at her rearview mirror. Nothing. Then why did she feel like someone was watching her? She slowed slightly, letting a beat pass. A black SUV sat a few cars behind her, keeping a steady distance. Not too close, not too far. Coincidence? Maybe. But she didn't believe in coincidences. Elena had spent too many years hunting men who didn't want to be found. She knew what a tail looked like, and right now she had one. Still, she didn't react. She couldn't afford to tip them off. Instead, she did what she had been trained to do. Stay calm, stay in control, and let them make the first move. If they wanted to stop her, they would have to show their hand. Then, just as she turned onto an empty stretch of road, it happened. Red and blue lights exploded behind her. The sharp wail of a siren shattered the silence, cutting through the stillness like a blade. Elena's grip tightened on the wheel. She hadn't broken any traffic laws. No speeding, no missed signals. There was no reason for a stop. Unless this wasn't about a traffic violation, this was about her. Taking a slow breath, she steadied herself and pulled over. The cold asphalt stretched before her, the dim glow of a streetlight casting eerie reflections on her windshield. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with anticipation. She had spent months exposing these men, and now they were finally making their move. The air outside was thick with silence. The distant hum of the city was a faint murmur in the background, drowned by the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the dark asphalt. Elena Ramirez sat still, her fingers resting on the steering wheel as her sharp eyes flicked to the side mirror. Two figures emerged from the police cruiser behind her. Mark Sullivan walked with slow, deliberate confidence, his heavy boots crunching against the pavement, his hand hovering near his belt where his gun rested. His partner, Jake Harris, followed a step behind, his movements less assured, a flicker of unease shadowing his face. Elena had studied both of them before. Mark Sullivan, the infamous enforcer, known for using his badge as a weapon to terrorize those he saw as beneath him. He didn't just enforce the law, he bent it to his will. Every complaint against him had mysteriously disappeared, every internal investigation conveniently closed. Jake Harris, the silent observer, a man trapped between loyalty and morality. Unlike Sullivan, he hadn't crossed the line fully, but by doing nothing he had become complicit. Sullivan tapped the butt of his flashlight against her window, the smirk on his face dripping with arrogance. "License and registration," he ordered, his tone laced with condescension. Elena didn't move. She kept her posture relaxed, but inside she was calculating every detail. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" Her voice was calm, measured. Sullivan scoffed. "You were driving suspiciously." There it was, no real reason. Just the vague excuse officers like him used to harass people they thought wouldn't fight back. Elena met his gaze through the glass, unwavering. "Suspiciously?" Sullivan leaned in closer, his smirk widening. "Yeah, someone like you, driving around here late at night, that's a problem." Jake shifted uncomfortably beside him, but said nothing. Elena knew this game. It was textbook intimidation, pull someone over, instill fear, provoke them. But Sullivan had made one critical mistake. Tonight, he had chosen the wrong person. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with anticipation. She had spent months exposing these men, and now they were finally making their move. The air outside was thick with silence. The distant hum of the city was a faint murmur in the background, drowned by the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the dark asphalt. Elena Ramirez sat still, her fingers resting on the steering wheel, as her sharp eyes flicked to the side mirror. Two figures emerged from the police cruiser behind her. Mark Sullivan walked with slow, deliberate confidence, his heavy boots crunching against the pavement, his hand hovering near his belt where his gun rested. His partner, Jake Harris, followed a step behind, his movements less assured, a flicker of unease shadowing his face. Elena had studied both of them before. Mark Sullivan, the infamous enforcer known for using his badge as a weapon to terrorize those he saw as beneath him. He didn't just enforce the law, he bent it to his will. Every complaint against him had mysteriously disappeared, every internal investigation conveniently closed. Jake Harris, the silent observer, a man trapped between loyalty and morality. Unlike Sullivan, he hadn't crossed the line fully, but by doing nothing he had become complicit. Sullivan tapped the butt of his flashlight against her window, the smirk on his face dripping with arrogance. "License and registration," he ordered, his tone laced with condescension. Elena didn't move. She kept her posture relaxed, but inside, she was calculating every detail. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" Her voice was calm, measured. Sullivan scoffed. "You were driving suspiciously." There it was. No real reason. Just the vague excuse officers like him used to harass people they thought wouldn't fight back. Elena met his gaze through the glass, unwavering. "Suspiciously?" Sullivan leaned in closer, his smirk widening. "Yeah, someone like you, driving around here, late at night, that's a problem." Jake shifted uncomfortably beside him but said nothing. Elena knew this game. It was textbook intimidation. Pull someone over, instill fear, provoke them. But Sullivan had made one critical mistake. Tonight, he had chosen the wrong person. Elena slowly reached for the glove compartment, her movements deliberate. But before opening it, she let her hand hover, her gaze steady on Sullivan. "So, let me get this straight. You pulled me over, but you can't tell me what law I've broken." Sullivan's eyes darkened. He was used to people cowering, pleading, complying without question, not questioning him like this. "I said, hand over your ID," he snapped, his tone sharp, his patience thinning. Instead of obeying, Elena reached into her pocket, pressing the record button on her phone. She positioned it subtly between the seat and the center console, its small red light blinking in the darkness. She wasn't just documenting this moment, she was building a case. Sullivan slammed his palm against her car door, the loud thud shattering the stillness. "Don't get smart with me." His voice dropped lower, more threatening. Jake flinched beside him, his hand grazing his own belt. But still, he said nothing. Elena, however, remained composed. "I know my rights, officer. You need a legitimate reason to demand my documents." Sullivan chuckled, shaking his head. "You think that matters? Out here I decide what's legitimate." Elena saw the way his fingers twitched near his holster, the way his jaw clenched when he realized she wasn't intimidated. She was winning this battle of control, and Sullivan hated it. Elena could see it in his eyes, the shift from calculated intimidation to unchecked rage. He wasn't used to being challenged. He wasn't used to someone looking him in the face without fear. And so he did what men like him always did when they lost control. He drew his gun. The metallic click was deafening in the silence. The barrel gleamed under the glow of the street light as he pointed it directly at Elena through the window. "Step out of the car. Now." His voice was low, firm, a threat wrapped in an order. Jake took a sharp breath, visibly tense now. He wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. He was afraid. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't justified use of force. This was a power move. Elena's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, but her expression remained unreadable. "Are you sure you want to do this, Officer Sullivan?" Her tone was eerily calm, which only enraged him more. "I said get out," he barked, his finger twitching dangerously close to the trigger. But Elena still didn't move. She could feel the weight of the gun's aim, but she also knew Sullivan was making the biggest mistake of his life, and she had every second of it recorded. Jake finally spoke up, his voice hesitant. "Mark, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Harris," Sullivan snapped without looking away from Elena. "She's resisting." Jake swallowed hard, his face paling. He knew exactly what Sullivan was trying to do. If Elena stepped out, she was vulnerable. If she stayed inside, he'd claim she was resisting orders, a lose-lose situation. But Elena wasn't playing his game. She slowly raised her hands, not in surrender, but in control. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice carrying the weight of something Sullivan wasn't expecting. Power. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. Something was wrong. Why wasn't she panicking? Why wasn't she pleading? Why did she look like she knew something he didn't? Because she did. And Sullivan had just given her everything she needed. For the first time since pulling her over, Mark Sullivan looked uncertain. The smirk that had been glued to his face was gone, replaced by a flicker of something else. Doubt. He had expected fear, compliance, panic, anything but calm defiance. And now, something in Elena's unwavering gaze unsettled him. Still gripping his gun, Mark jerked his chin toward her. Out of the car, now. Elena moved slowly, her hands still raised in controlled composure. But before opening the door, she finally did what Mark should have done from the start. She handed over her ID. Mark barely glanced at it, until one word caught his eye. Federal Investigator. His breath hitched. His fingers tightened around the ID, crumpling the edges, his brain racing. This wasn't possible. He had thought she was just another nobody, someone he could intimidate, maybe rough up a little to prove a point. But this was a nightmare. His grip on the gun trembled for half a second before he clenched his jaw and forced his composure back. Think, Mark. Think. He couldn't back down now. Not in front of Harris, not with his authority on the line. A federal agent, he muttered under his breath. His mind scrambled for a way out. Well, I don't see your badge out, Ramirez. How do I know this isn't fake? Elena's lips barely twitched, a subtle movement that wasn't quite a smile, but something close. That's the excuse you're going with? She asked, tilting her head. You really want to double down on this? Mark's jaw ticked. For the first time, he wasn't in control anymore, and he knew it. Then, before Mark could respond, the night exploded with the sound of approaching sirens. Multiple police vehicles turned the corner, tires screeching against the pavement, their flashing lights bathing the street in red and blue. Mark's breath caught in his throat. No. This wasn't supposed to happen. He turned sharply toward Jake, his eyes burning with suspicion. Did you call this in? Jake looked just as shocked as he was, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly. I didn't say anything. Mark's stomach plummeted. Because that meant only one thing. Elena had set him up. She had known. She had recorded everything. And she had baited him into exposing himself. His heart pounded wildly, adrenaline morphing into pure panic as he watched the first police SUV come to a halt. The driver's door swung open and out stepped a man Mark had feared even more than Ramirez. Chief Raymond Vaughn. Vaughn wasn't just the head of the department. He was a man who despised corruption, and the way his sharp gaze locked onto Mark told him exactly how this was going to go. Mark could barely breathe. This wasn't just a bad night anymore. This was the end. The street fell into silence as Vaughn approached, his expression unreadable. Mark forced himself to straighten, masking his panic with an air of forced authority. Chief, I can explain. No need. Vaughn cut him off, his voice eerily calm. Then, Elena pulled out her phone. With one simple motion, she pressed play, and his own voice betrayed him. You think that matters? Out here, I decide what's legitimate. The words hung in the air, sharp as a blade. Don't get smart with me. Step out of the car, now. Let's see what happens when you don't listen to me. Mark's entire body stiffened. His throat dried as he glanced around, officers watching him, their expressions shifting. He wasn't one of them anymore. He was the enemy, and this time, no one was going to cover for him. Vaughn exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Mark Sullivan, you are under arrest for abuse of power, threatening a federal agent, and obstruction of justice. The words slammed into him like a sledgehammer. Mark's pulse skyrocketed. This wasn't how it ended. He had spent years untouchable, protected by the very system he had helped to corrupt. This couldn't be happening. His gaze darted to Jake, searching for backup, but his partner wouldn't even look at him anymore. That's when Mark snapped. He moved fast, lunging for his gun, eyes wild, his last desperate bid for control. But Vaughn was faster. Before Mark could even lift the weapon, a sharp kick to his wrist sent the gun flying onto the pavement. Within seconds, 3 officers tackled him to the ground. His face slammed against the asphalt, his arms yanked behind his back, cold metal cuffs snapping shut around his wrists. The mighty Mark Sullivan, on the ground, powerless. The irony burned like fire. He had done this to others for years. Now it was happening to him. As Mark was yanked to his feet, his mind spun in chaos. But then something unexpected happened. Jake Harris stepped forward, and for the first time in his career, he made a choice. "I have something to say." The crowd turned to him, Vaughn raising an eyebrow. "Go on." Jake swallowed hard, then exhaled. "Mark isn't the only one involved in this. He's protected by people higher up. There are others. I can name names." Mark's stomach dropped, betrayed by the very man who had stood by his side all these years. Jake wouldn't meet his eyes, because deep down, he knew he should have spoken up long ago. But now finally, he did. It didn't take long. The media caught wind of the arrest almost immediately. Within hours, headlines blazed across the news. "Corrupt cop arrested in federal sting." "Officer Sullivan exposed. Department-wide investigation begins." Video clips of his arrest, of his own words being played against him, flooded social media. And just like that, the untouchable Mark Sullivan was finished. But Elena Ramirez knew this wasn't over, because Sullivan, he was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. And now, the entire system was about to crumble. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, legal experts, activists, everyone wanted to witness the trial of Mark Sullivan, the officer whose abuse of power had been exposed to the world. The prosecution wasted no time. They played the recording. "You think that matters? Out here, I decide what's legitimate. Let's see what happens when you don't listen to me." Every word condemned him further. The jury listened in complete silence, the weight of Sullivan's arrogance crashing down upon him like a tidal wave. And then came the real bombshell. The deeper investigators dug, the more they found. Sullivan wasn't just one bad cop. He was a key player in a much larger web of corruption. Financial records exposed secret payouts from criminal organizations. Case files showed deliberately buried evidence, manipulated reports, and fabricated testimonies. More officers fell with him. Names that had once been untouchable were now under investigation. And then Jake Harris took the stand. The man who had stayed silent for years finally spoke. He revealed everything he knew: the intimidation tactics, the officers who helped Sullivan cover up crimes, the way complaints disappeared before they even reached internal affairs. Jake's cooperation earned him leniency, but he didn't walk away unscathed. His punishment: suspension, demotion, and a permanent stain on his record. But for the first time, he had done the right thing. Sullivan, however, wasn't so lucky. The verdict was swift: guilty on all charges. The sentence? 12 years in federal prison. And with that, the once untouchable officer Mark Sullivan was led out of the courtroom in shackles, his face pale, his hands trembling. His reign of terror was over. Sullivan's arrest sent shockwaves through law enforcement. It wasn't just one corrupt officer. It was a system that had protected him. The government could no longer ignore the public outrage. Citizens demanded reform, and this time they were heard. Mass suspensions followed. Internal investigations unearthed more officers involved in corruption. Some who had accepted bribes, others who had covered up misconduct, and many who had simply looked the other way. 34 officers were fired. Several high-ranking officials resigned before they could be investigated. The department wasn't just cleaning house, it was being rebuilt from the ground up. And leading that charge, Chief Raymond Vaughn. The department restructured its oversight policies, introduced independent civilian review boards, and mandated body cameras for all officers, with severe consequences for tampering with footage. But the biggest change? Accountability. For the first time, officers were no longer above the law. When Elena first stepped into the spotlight, it wasn't by choice. But after Sullivan's conviction, her name became a symbol of justice. She had stood her ground. She had exposed corruption. And she had proven that no one, not even those in power, was beyond accountability. Her story spread like wildfire. She was invited to speak on national television where she called for deeper reform beyond just one department. Protesters held up signs with her name. Social media erupted with messages of support. The world saw her as proof that one person could stand up against a corrupt system and win. But for Elena, this wasn't a victory lap. This was just the beginning. Because for every Mark Sullivan that fell, there were dozens more like him still out there. And as long as they existed, she wasn't done fighting. Months later, a new wave of laws was introduced to prevent what happened from ever happening again. A federal oversight committee was formed to investigate police misconduct without department interference. Whistleblower protections were strengthened, ensuring that officers who spoke out wouldn't face retaliation. Independent prosecutors were appointed for cases involving police violence and corruption, removing conflicts of interest. Mandatory de-escalation training and racial bias education became requirements for all officers. The Elena Ramirez Bill, a landmark policy requiring immediate release of body cam footage after critical incidents, was passed in multiple states. Elena never expected her name to become part of history, but it did. Because of her, a system that had once thrived on silence was now being forced to listen. One night, months after Sullivan's conviction, Elena stood at her window, looking out over the city. The same city where she had almost lost everything, the same city where justice had finally won. Her phone buzzed. A new case, another officer under investigation. She exhaled slowly, running a hand through her hair. The fight wasn't over, not even close. She grabbed her jacket, heading for the door, because corruption didn't sleep, and neither did she. The city stretched before her, bathed in the glow of distant streetlights. From her office window, Elena Ramirez watched as cars zipped along the roads, the hum of life continuing as if the world had never changed. And maybe for most people it hadn't, but for her, everything was different. She had won a battle, but the war against corruption, that was far from over. Mark Sullivan was gone, rotting in a prison cell, stripped of his power, his influence reduced to nothing but a cautionary tale. But Elena knew the truth. For every Sullivan exposed, there were dozens more waiting in the shadows, still manipulating the system, still hiding behind their badges. And though Sullivan had fallen, he wasn't the real problem. The system had allowed him to exist. That was the real enemy, a system where complaints were ignored, where officers who spoke out were punished, while those who abused their power were protected, where people were afraid to challenge authority because history had taught them that justice was a privilege, not a right. But now, people had proof that change was possible, that one voice, even against an entire corrupt system, could be enough to start a revolution. Her phone buzzed beside her. Another case, another officer accused of abuse of power. Elena sighed, rubbing her temples. It never stopped. But maybe that was the point. Justice wasn't a moment. It was a fight, one that had to be fought every single day. She grabbed her jacket and headed for the door, knowing she was stepping right back into the fire. Because the moment you stopped fighting, corruption 1. Do you think real justice can ever be achieved? Comment below. Your voice matters.